Hi, let's discuss shape layers in Photoshop and see how they can help you in your projects. We've established that shapes bear this symbol in the Layers panel. They're also vectors, and this means they can be resized to your heart's content without losing quality. This means one of your go-to hotkeys is going to be Ctrl-T. Through it, you can modify them on the spot. We'll focus on these tools from the left panel because these create shapes. Let's start with rectangle shape layers. To add one to your canvas, you have two main options. One, we can click and drag, and that's my preferred method. As I'm dragging, I also get its size, which is very helpful because it keeps me focused on my work. The second method is great when you want specific measurements. You click and you get this window. Let's put in something like 500 by 200 pixels. And there you go. Let's move our focus up top for a bit. In the options bar, make sure you have these settings. First, we need to have shape selected in this drop-down. The fill will determine the rectangle's colour, and this is taken from your foreground swatch. Let me choose two new colours so you can see how this works. OK, we have a nice red shade. And for the background, I'll go with blue. Now I'll hit X a few times and you'll notice how this preview changes. I can also click on it and I'll have several swatches. My advice is you skip this step. Use any colour, and then if you want to change it, just double-click the shape's thumbnail. The change is immediately shown on the canvas, and this is how I prefer to work. The stroke is another one I'd leave as is. You can see its weight is set at 2 pixels, but we also have this white rectangle that has a diagonal red line going through it. That means the stroke is disabled. So no matter what I have written in this field, no stroke is going to show up on the canvas, and that's totally fine by me. Back to the right side, we have another setting. Back in the days of Photoshop CS5, when you added shape layers to your canvas, you'd sometimes get blurry edges. Long gone are those days, and in CC 2017 it's nearly impossible to get fuzzy shape layers by mistake. Nevertheless, this is what this Align Edges feature does. It ensures your shapes will be crisp. Moving to the toolbox, the only difference between these two rectangle tools is this radius setting from the options bar. This will determine the roundness of your rectangle's edges. So if I put in a value of, say, 20 pixels, this is what I'm going to end up with on my canvas. But here's the thing. You've probably noticed this Properties panel pops up every time I add a new shape. This is my number one choice when it comes down to adjusting my rectangles. The most important feature introduced in the first CC version was this area here. Through it, you can change the corner radius on the fly. I have it set at 20 pixels because that's what I typed in that field from the options bar, but I can change it to 0 and press enter. Now our layer has just transformed into a regular rectangle. So this separation is no longer relevant in CC versions of Photoshop, but it's been there for so many years, Adobe decided to leave both tools in. But this Live Shape Properties panel, that's its official name by the way, is absolutely phenomenal. Not only can you adjust the corner radius, you can do that for each individual corner. By default, this chain icon is enabled, which means all 4 will adjust based on any change I make in any field. So if I write 10 and hit enter, all of them are going to update. But I can hit this icon and now I'll write 25 for the bottom ones. This gives me a lot of flexibility. I can also square them off by replacing these values with 0. Great stuff. And it's easy to get started with it because this panel pops up immediately after you've placed your first rectangle. Moving up, we have our width and height values here. This means you don't have to use Ctrl-T to resize it. That's still a valid option, but this is a good alternative. We also have this shape's position on the canvas starting from the top left corner. I already explained how this works, but let me quickly go through it again. X determines the shape's position horizontally starting from the left side. If I change it to 0, my rectangle is going to touch the left edge of my canvas. Change that to 100 and it's going to move 100 pixels to the right. Y refers to the vertical axis and the same thing applies here. 0 will cause it to touch the top edge, while 200 will move it 200 pixels downwards. Moving down in this panel, we also have controls for its stroke, but again, I suggest you don't enable it because we have a layer style that does a much better job. When you create a new shape by dragging on the canvas, hold Shift and this will constrain your proportions. This means that if you're on a rectangle tool, you'll get a perfect square. As you can see, Shift prevents me from reshaping it as I drag. Of course, I can always let go and this will give me full control over it. This applies to the ellipse tool as well. Hold Shift while you drag and you'll get a circle. Please note, ellipses don't have as many settings in this Live Shapes Properties panel, and that makes sense because they don't have any corners to control. Other than that, everything we've talked about is exactly the same. The Polygon tool is great when you want to create triangles, stars, and all sorts of other shapes that have lots of sides. To control that amount, you can use this field from the options bar, but my advice is to click anywhere on the canvas. You'll get a new window that asks you the size, how many sides, but more importantly, if you want it to have smooth corners. If I set it at 100 by 100 pixels with 3 sides and leave this unchecked, I'll get a triangle as you'd expect. When I click again, there's something I want you to be aware of. My size is 100 by 100, and that's not because that was the last value that I wrote in. No, this is taken from the last shape I clicked on. So if I select this layer, as long as it's a shape, once I click to create a new one, I'll get its measurements in these fields. This isn't limited to the Polygon tool. All these other tools work in the same way. Anyway, back to what I was saying. If I enable smooth corners with the same 100 by 100 settings, I'll get this weird looking shape. I can also create all sorts of stars with various looks. I suggest you explore these settings on your own as they're straightforward and they require a bit of experimentation to get used to them. Let's move over to the line tool, which is seriously underused, but that's for a good reason. You can't click on the canvas to input any measurements. Instead, you have to click and drag. You set its thickness from up top, but I suggest you keep it at 1 pixel. Besides using Shift to make it perfectly straight, there's little to say about it. Most designers, myself included, don't use it because we can get the same thing with the rectangle tool. I can switch to it and input a height of 1 pixel. This gives me everything the line tool offers. Plus, I can always use Ctrl-T and resize my thickness. So to sum it up, the line tool is pretty much worthless. Finally, going back to the toolbox, we have custom shapes, but they're a topic for another lecture, so we'll cover those separately. This concludes the first lecture in this section. Initially, it seemed like we had a lot of tools in this panel, but in everyday projects, you'll most likely use only 1 or 2. Okay, I'll see you soon.